Welcome to week 5 class, right on the edge of our first exam. All right, I'm your host, John Parks, for another week in American history. This lecture, we're going to cover the American Revolution. Last week, we were talking about all the causes that built up to it, whether there were some political rifts between the motherland and the colonies, rifts between Parliament and the various assemblies, and the king and the various assemblies. But we also covered, right, and I think this is more important, many of the economic aspects, issues in trade, issues in acquisition of land, the feeling of new colonists being cut out from access to the whole point of even coming to the colonies, right? Kind of building your own life, having your own family, not being reduced to some state of servitude, whether it was working in a city for the equivalent of a master, or just being shut out from all the machinery of government. So this week we're going to cover some of that. I'm going to give you a pretty basic overlay of the American Revolution. If you want more details, especially in terms of the wars and stuff, you're going to have to look in your textbook. But this week I want to also focus specifically on the case of Pennsylvania, because I think Pennsylvania represents both as sort of a radical example, an outlier. It shows you some of the potential in the American Revolution as truly revolutionary event. But it also shows you sort of how it tempered and how it cooled down and reflected a lot of the issues and problems of actually participating in a revolution. So anyway, let's get started. So first, right, I want to just recap what we talked about last week. At the very end of the lecture, right, I had mentioned just briefly the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world. And this was the moment when, right, and this is the same time that the king had made it very clear that he was not interested in compromise. He was not interested in negotiation. The colonies needed to submit because they were simply out of line, right? So, in the meantime, while the Continental Congress, which you shouldn't think of it as a government, it's more like a forum. All of the different colonies, they didn't know what to do, so they all banded together and tried to sort of figure things out for themselves. So, in the meantime, they're trying to figure out what to do. Some colonies, like Massachusetts and Virginia, were already starting to push for independence. Other colonies, like actually Pennsylvania, but also colonies like New York and South Carolina, were very, very, very hesitant about anything that smacked of separation. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But in the meantime, right, the British are landing soldiers. There was a fight in Massachusetts. That's where Lexington and Concord are. So the Continental Congress appoints a well-known, well-respected, wealthy Virginia gentleman who had a complicated but respectable career as a military officer. And of course, I'm talking about George Washington. We already mentioned 2 weeks ago, right? He was instrumental in causing the 7 Years' War. He didn't personally cause it, but his bungling of a military expedition was the spark needed to set off the hostility between France and Britain to erupt basically into one of the first world wars. So anyway, Washington had sort of a checkered career, but he was able and willing, and the Continental Congress saw Virginia as the oldest and most revered of the 13 colonies to be the one to sort of lead the way. So even though people in the Congress were not interested in independence yet, or at least it was still being debated, they needed an army. They needed to protect themselves in case, right, the British continued to march towards Philadelphia. So, right, what was on the table, right? Remember some of the economic issues for colonial angst. So, in the case of Massachusetts, which had a large trading population. Um, the war, or at least independence, represented Massachusetts basically trying to renegotiate its terms. Massachusetts suffered the most, probably, of any of the colonies under the new trading restrictions. And a lot of Massachusetts merchants wanted better, greater access to basically free trade. Also, there were some issues with long-term issues that we talked about, right? Massachusetts kind of coveting its own kind of independence, its own unique history as this colony set up by people running away from England, and they saw themselves as part of a longer trajectory of history. But, and this is what made it hard for the other three merchant-based colonies to go along. Um, Business was good for the British Empire if you were a merchant. The Navy protected you. You didn't have to worry about being pirated or attacked by a rival nation. And, while Massachusetts had a lot of smaller traders who were interested in greater free trade access, a lot of merchants were not so keen on that. So that's why, right, and as we'll see with Pennsylvania, but that's why the other big merchant depots did not want to go to war. That was particularly Pennsylvania, right, because of Philadelphia, South Carolina because of Charleston, and New York because of New York City, right? So anyway, those three were hesitant, but Massachusetts, looking for greater trade access and some of its own kind of unique urban situation, was a spearhead for pushing for independence. And then Virginia. Virginia not only had these old, ancient kind of privileges, and by ancient, of course, I only mean a couple hundred years. It's not really that old when you think of it. But Virginia felt slighted by Great Britain's policies. It did not respect the House of Burgesses being able to set its own policies in basically reducing them to a subordinate to Parliament, which was a great blow to their honor. And additionally, right, we talked about the Ohio Company that George Washington worked for. Virginia was big on land speculating. They wanted to continue to expand west. Many Virginians felt shut out by the restrictions from the proclamation line about expanding further west, right? There was land in Ohio, and what will be modern day western Pennsylvania and Ohio. There was land elsewhere that Virginia was kind of bordering on, right? Kentucky, Tennessee, so on, that they wanted to get into and have access. So pushing back against the crown for their slights against Virginia's ancient rights and for its blow to Virginia's wealth expansion helped kind of galvanize the colony towards rebellion. But like I said, merchants were very hesitant, especially in these big merchant-based cities. But also, on the other hand, a lot of small landowners or people who wanted to be landowners saw great opportunities in independence, right? They wanted to keep moving west. They didn't like that the crown, seemingly arbitrarily, right, against their own rights and privileges as free Englishmen, or so they thought, right? They're restricting them from access. Now, of course, as we mentioned, part of the reason George III did this was to restrain the conflict between colonists and Indian nations. It was also part of the deal with kind of cementing the Iroquois as a British ally in light of France leaving. Right, Britain was able to sort of seduce the Iroquois Confederacy. Remember, 6 nations. Think of it like 5 fingers on your fist. 5 different peoples, but one shared foreign policy. That's going to come up. That's why I want you to remember it. And this is the lecture where you're going to see them basically collapse as a empire. But in the meantime, right, the point being, the Iroquois sided with the British because the British said that they could restrain their colonists and sort of create zones, right? On the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, that's Indian country for whatever nation, and then on the eastern side of the Appalachian, that's British zone, right? Whether it's particular colonies, Englishmen, traders, foreign immigrants, whether they're German or they're Dutch merchants or whatever, right? That's their zone, and the Indians have their zone, and they have a strong border, and the border is supposed to protect relations. But of course, right, by creating this hard border, a lot of people wanted to go over the border. They wanted to buy up land. They were willing to negotiate with Indians, sometimes fairly, other times not so fairly, sometimes really brutally, right? There was this growing racialization in some colonies that say, right, like, and you see that in the Paxton Boys, they just said, right, the only good Indian's a dead Indian. We cannot coexist. It's over between us. But of course, there are other people who thought coexistence was possible. So you see that with someone like Thomas Jefferson, who kind of hoped that English people or European-born people and Indians would all kind of mix together as one race, and the Indians would learn how to settle down, and many of them did, right, adopting British ways. Um, they wanted to, to settle down as farmers, stop hunting, maybe convert to Christianity, or at least learn European habits. Um, so there, there's some Indians who are interested in that, others not so much, right? That's what the Pan-Indian movement, even though it was influenced by Christianity and some European morals and so on and so forth. It was very much about trying to design a Indian way of life that's opposed to the white man. So these racialized borders come from both sides, and it's to reflect this growing conflict over resources. Who gets land, right? Whether it's for hunting or for farming or for settling down and having a family, it was over who gets access to the land. Small farmers felt cut out. Big farmers, it's not so much if you have a big plantation. I mean, some of these guys are really greedy. They want access to more land too, but the small guy, the little guy, he wants his fair cut. He feels like he's being sold out by his government. And it's a variety of Indian nations are not quite sure about what to do with the British. They're not sure how to relate to the colonies, and they're trying to figure out what to do. So we're going to come back to that in a second, but that's basically where we are in 1775. Now I'm going to come back to some of this stuff in a minute, but I just want to touch on this very, very briefly, right? During the 18th century, you have a phenomenon known as the Enlightenment. This is a moment of kind of philosophical inquiry, scientific exploration, a lot of new ideas. You see the development of what was known as the Republic of Letters, basically an international, and by international I mean European, but an international fellowship of scholars, intellects, what they called themselves philosophers, which literally means the lovers of wisdom. In French, it's philosophe, and they were kind of engaged in trying to find new ways forward. Now, there's a long, complicated history. Some of the Enlightenment, right? It's like, it's in the word, right? Like, oh, it's really dark in here, and then somebody found the light switch. Flick, right? Now we have light. Now we have, and by light they mean reason. So, right, no more superstition. Right? We can subject religion and our cultures and our politics and our social organization and so on and so on and so on. We can subject that to the withering light and critique of reason, right? Oh, if we just think about it, we can find a rational way of doing stuff. Of course, I mean, this is kind of beyond the scope of this class, but I would argue reason is only a tool. It doesn't necessarily tell you what you're supposed to do with it, right? So by the time of the end of the 18th century, the Enlightenment project's already in kind of crisis mode about trying to understand what it is. Not everything can be subjected to reason, because what if you subject reason to reason? Then you end up with, the potential for just irrational skepticism, which a very popular and dangerous British philosopher named David Hume had basically done, saying you cannot prove or know really anything. You cannot define and defend a concept like causation, right? That, like, if I throw a ball and the ball flies across the room and lands on the other side, and I say, why did that ball get over there? It's because I threw it, right? He says you can't actually prove that without sort of circular arguments that depend upon justifying reason by reason. You can't actually explain reason. So we really don't know anything. Anyway, even though that crisis is sort of ongoing, and the Enlightenment, right, it's happening among the Germans, it's happening among the British, it's happening among the French, and so on and so forth. It's a very complicated phenomenon, and probably has its roots in social disintegration. And that's a longer argument. If you're interested in that, I can email you about it. That's actually part of what my own research involves. Um, and it's not just, oh, like we're dumb, and then one day, oh man, why don't we just think for ourselves? Boom, enlightenment. No. But these are the two concepts that we want to talk about real briefly that are influential for America. America has its own kind of enlightenment period. Actually, some of the people associated with the American Enlightenment will not join the patriot cause, or would have been hostile if they had lived for it. And of course, others like Benjamin Franklin, who's one of the key figures of the American Enlightenment, is a big supporter of independence. But two ideas that are really key. First, consent of the governed. This idea that society, and this is sort of derived from a philosopher named John Locke, that became kind of popular in America, but he's not the only one. That maybe society should be thought of as a big contract, right? The governed have a contract with the governors, the government, and they say, right, you do these things for us, and we do these things for you. But, right, if you break your end of the deal, we owe you nothing, right? Just like a contract, right? If you're renting from someone and they say, oh, we're gonna fix this stuff, and you say you didn't do that, right? So I'm withholding my rent, and actually, that's legally allowed, right, to a certain extent. So there's this kind of contractual arrangement that's being understood as society, right, by the people. And we're gonna come to this question: who are the people? Right? What do we mean by that? Do we mean literally everyone? No, of course not. So who are we talking about? And I say of course not because, right, nobody says babies should have the right to vote. Maybe you think babies should have the right to vote, but most people would not say that. Or restrictions on criminals, restrictions on the mentally enfeebled or insane, right? They shouldn't necessarily be able to vote, so on and so forth. So what do we mean by the people? Nevertheless, this idea that those who are governed, right, there's the Lockean contractual view. There's also another view that we could call republicanism, which is basically societies are made up of its citizens, and every citizen has a right to participate. Both of these are generally associated with the Enlightenment. Both of these are key elements in influencing American political thought. The other thing, as I kind of already mentioned, is nature and reason. So the idea is a number of Enlightenment people are kind of conventional or Orthodox Christians, whether Catholics or Protestants. But maybe they're kind of pushing on the way societies form themselves or how to think about it. But then there are some people kind of pushing the envelope, forming a new kind of philosophical theology or religion known as deism. And in deism, the idea is that God is basically like an architect or some kind of clockmaker. And so he designed the universe, he built everything, but now it just kind of runs on its own. So the way to honor God is not by engaging in strange rituals. So deists tended to be critical to some extent of Christianity. Some of the earlier deists said, no, we're actually the true Christians. We're truly Protestant. We're purging the last vestiges of superstition, rejecting beliefs like the Trinity, the Incarnation, sacrament, so on and so forth. If you don't know what that is, just look up Christianity in Wikipedia. Those terms are kind of explained, but I don't want to get into all that. But anyway, purge out those ideas. And God gave us reason. God gave us rational faculty. We can investigate stuff. We can build things, right? That's the way we honor God. So we should just figure out the way the universe works, and boom, it's easy, it's consistent if you just apply your mind. Now this project collapses, but we're not going to get into that too much in this class. But the idea, and this is this guy right here, you're going to look at him this week. His name's Thomas Paine. He's a very interesting guy, but he is a big proponent of the idea, right? You can build society by just reasoning your way through it, right? What makes the most sense? And those are the laws of the land. That's how society should be organized. That's how we should conduct ourselves as a people in terms of religion and in terms of culture and in terms of anything. So, but Thomas Paine was very optimistic that if we were freed from these superstitious bonds, then the sky's the limit. And so he was a very strong deist. He actually gets in trouble because he's a pretty intense critic of Christianity. He gets kicked out, restrained from going back to the United States for a while because of some of the things he says. Um, but the idea is basically, look, you just look out in the world and you can figure out how to do everything and build your society, and that's nature, right? So this week, right, I had you last week and into this week, I had you do a little assignment reading and writing about the Declaration of Independence. So I just want to go through some of this stuff, key parts of it. Maybe you missed, just want to fill it in, right? So you can clearly see the influence of the Enlightenment in this text. Thomas Jefferson was the main author, but he was also, right, and so this is this famous portrait, which is totally fictional because they didn't ever get together like this, but that's Thomas Jefferson, right, and he was the main author, and he was joined with Ben Franklin and John Adams. But you can clearly see the influence of the Enlightenment, talking about nature's God, the law of nature, this idea that yes, there are societies, they're formed historically, right? Just like, when you compare different city plans, there are cities that sort of grow organically. People just start living in places, and the roads and the shops kind of pop up in relation to how people are living and the geography. And then, of course, right, there are the more quote unquote enlightened cities like Philadelphia where it's a grid pattern. It's, and this, the way that Philadelphia actually develops is sort of a sign that this form of enlightenment planning is not or it needs some level of criticism if it's going to survive. But anyway, because Philadelphia doesn't actually work the way it was planned, but we won't get into that. But it's the idea that societies develop historically, but you can look outside of history, look outside of just the your family, your bonds as a people, as a group, and you can kind of look out and sort of discern from nature how things are supposed to be. And you don't have to rely on history or custom or tradition. You can just sort of throw that in the trash can if it's getting in your way. So there are more radical people who just say, forget history, just trash it. You can just figure it out with reason. And then there are people who are more balanced, who are more critical about this project. Nevertheless, when it talks about nature's law, nature's God, that's sort of what it's referring to, and the stuff we just talked about is a big part of it. Another interesting thing you might not notice, right? The key line in this text, right? Governments are created for the pursuit of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, right? But this is a triad, this is a triple statement that was modified by Jefferson, which was originally taken from Locke, which is about governments are supposed to protect life, liberty, and property. So Jefferson actually kind of modified this to reflect his own philosophical beliefs about human life. And happiness isn't just an emotion, but it's sort of human well-being. So the idea that governments are supposed to promote human well-being is something Jefferson believes in, though how he believes in it is very different. We'll cover some of that later in another lecture. But how Jefferson imagines some of this stuff is not what you might think of as governments investing in people's well-being. He does not believe in some kind of social security state or anything. But we'll get to that. Another thing, right, we already mentioned, right, the text talks about the right of the people. Again, what is the people? So we get a concept of representational government, which means that how do the people talk? How do the people listen, or kind of govern themselves? It's by electing representatives. So you pick a guy, or in this case it's just a guy, but now a guy or a girl, and they're supposed to represent your voices, whether because they just know better than you or because they're supposed to respond to you, and you say, we vote for you because you say you're going to do this and this and this, and then you're supposed to go and do it. These are some complexities we won't get into, but nevertheless, right, there's a question. Sometimes you think, what people are we talking about? Everybody? And as we'll see later in this lecture and throughout this class, right, no, not everybody. And not everyone's happy about how this is restricted, right? Of course, you might think Indians, slaves, women, people who don't actually have votes or may not even be legally citizens. But then you're right. There's also a lot of small people can't actually vote. We're going to get to that when we look at Pennsylvania. And then finally, another thing, which is all over the place in this text, which you may have noticed, was the importance of the army and the army's dependence upon civil authority. That's a key element to the complaints that Jefferson and Adams and Franklin and the rest of the signers are kind of bringing an attention to, right? The idea that can the military basically just occupy us? Does the military have a special, unique place in society? Can it just be independent and kind of do whatever it wants? A lot of early American, patriots, as they call themselves, they're very hostile to these ideas, which maybe sometimes we take for granted. The idea that we just have a standing army, right? They're just military bases full of soldiers being paid by the government, just on standby. Right? They feared this, and some of the changing dimensions of society kind of influenced this, but nevertheless, they feared this because, hey, why couldn't the government just turn the army against us? What if they just send the army to crack down if the government's getting out of control, becoming too tyrannical, assuming too many powers, becoming a despot? So the idea is that you got to restrain the army, and part of that was having an army made up of citizens. Part of that was having an army that only existed in a time of war. Part of that was having an army that would listen to only the elected officials of the people that it occupied, right? So in this case, the British army was being appointed by Parliament, being sent by the king, and so American delegates for the Continental Congress saw this was way way overstepping the boundaries that Parliament had, right? It didn't consult the assemblies. It did not consult the royal governors, all of whom had kind of either given up or had their powers restricted. And so this was just a blow against, right? And they'll talk about English liberties, British liberties. As British subjects, they have certain freedoms. The king is not protecting them. The Parliament's definitely not protecting them. And so this is a reason why we have to separate. So the army is a big reason why a lot of the colonies start to gravitate towards independence, feeling their rights are being stripped, and then being forced to be less than British, which they saw as their great heritage and right. And so, that's why I talked about the binary a lot, right? How British people imagine themselves as the complete opposite of the French and of Indians. And so this is the interesting way that this binary ends up becoming catalyzed. It gets like radically transformed, where they're so British, they're so hyper British, they're so in love with all the things that make Britain great, all of its freedoms, all of its rights, and its wealth and prosperity and access to different parts of society for many different kinds of people. They believe in it so much that when the British government stops acting British, the Americans will take it to themselves to say, actually, right, maybe these aren't just British rights, they're rights for anyone, and as Americans, these belong to us. So this is the great irony that in their desire to defend their British liberties, their British way of life, they end up going to war in almost like a civil war kind of way. And we'll look at that a little bit, if that really fits or not. But in almost in a civil war kind of way, they'll go to war with their own parent country to just defend the idea of their parent country. So anyway, those are some thoughts. I don't know if you picked up on any of those, but those are some of the themes that you see some of the major themes cropping up in the Declaration of Independence. So in this part, I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Revolutionary War. A lot more of the details you can find in your textbook. And again, right, the textbook's just a general overview. If you have any specific questions about battles and stuff, I can try to help you if you want to send me an email. But I just want to give you a brief overlay because I want to get to the specifics of Pennsylvania. So first, Washington's appointed. 1776 rolls around. Declaration of Independence is manifest. All of the colonies, by hook or by crook, sign it. And so all 13 are kind of hanging together as a one group, waging war against the world's most powerful empire. So how are they going to do this? How are they going to pull this off, right? These people aren't stupid. They know that they are weak people compared to the British Empire, right? They don't have a professional military. They don't have a navy. They don't really have any money. They barely have supplies. They got people who will fight, um, but only some people, right? You can't push people too hard. Only 3% of the colonies, 3% of the people in the colonies will actually fight in the Revolutionary War, whether as a militia member, which means sort of like a volunteer group, or they'll sign up as a professional soldier under General Washington. But this is a very small group, and anyway, they know they're kind of weak, they know they're struggling, and they're trying to kind of carve out a strategy. So George Washington maybe is not, I mean, really, he's not a great general. He's not listed as one of the world's best generals, but he's smart for the occasion. What makes George Washington really bright when it comes to winning the American Revolution and getting American independence is what he kind of expects to do. So on the one hand, George Washington is really interested in survival. He knows that if he loses his army, he's done. If the states, or the newly independent states, can't keep an army in the field, a professional army, an army that looks like an army with guns and uniforms and generals and a hierarchy, if they can't keep that, they're done, right? No way. So George Washington plays very cautiously. He's trying to only provoke the British into battles he knows he can win. He's trying to sort of draw them into a quagmire, kind of constant guerrilla warfare where the British are just sort of being chipped away at in terms of morale. Right? The soldiers are kind of giving up. The war is costing the British government too much money. They can't sustain it. So Washington just wants to sort of drag this out as long as possible, which to some extent he's very successful. Right? The war goes on for 7 years, and the British government is sort of brought to the limit in terms of what they can spend. So that's a key element, right? And that's part of this picture is George Washington at Valley Forge, right? It's about persevering, right? Hanging in there, keeping people fighting, and keeping the British locked down. And a lot of colonial powers in later times in the 19th and 20th century are going to take heart from the American Revolution. In fact, there's the great irony that in the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh was a great admirer of General Washington, and he liked the United States actually a lot. And so he actually took some of these strategies and sort of deployed them for himself, right? Just draw the Americans into a war they can't win. So, and then chip away at them and kind of keep them from winning any specific battle that will devastate the North Vietnamese army. So it's kind of funny because he's fighting against the United States. It's ironic. But anyway, that's George Washington's strategy. The other main thing connected to survival is maintaining credibility. Because what George Washington wants is to prove to the world, and by the world he means Europe, that the United States, as they called themselves, was going to be a power worth dealing with. Right? If they're just sort of a little movement, fizzles out, European powers are not going to engage and try to fight back against the British. They're just going to let them go their own way. So Washington has to prove that the Americans are serious, that they're committed, and then they can win. Right? So this is why the victory at Saratoga is so important. So 1776 rolls by. The Americans are struggling. They're suffering. They're on their own. The Continental Congress starts sending feelers out, right? What if we can get the French to help us? The French hate the British. We'll get them to ally with us, which is kind of horrifying to some people because they say, hey, wait, we're defending our British liberties. Why would we ally with the French? Right? Aren't they the opposite? Well, doesn't matter, right? It's called realpolitik. It's the idea that you just got to do what you got to do in political situations to survive and to thrive. So if the enemy of my enemy is my, that whole cliche, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? If you're going to do that, then you might as well side with France. But why would the French get involved, right? They just, they want revenge. They want to stick the British in the eye. But wars are expensive, so you got to prove that this is a war worth winning. They don't want to join in and then the colonies give up, and then France is stuck fighting another war against the British that they really don't want to do and they can't really afford if they're going to lose. 1777 rolls around. the general at the in Saratoga, New York, the general in charge is a guy named Horatio Gates. If you look in your textbook, he's actually a complete idiot. He's not very good as a general, but he wins in Saratoga, mainly, ironically, due to his second in command, a guy named Benedict Arnold, who will go on to betray the American cause, the patriot cause, and join with the British. But he's actually one of the most talented generals in the American military, and mainly because of him, Horatio Gates wins the stunning victory at Saratoga. It's a army on army battle, which means the American line shows up and the British line shows up, and this is how early modern combat works. They showed up, they're wearing their uniforms, they got their guns, they fire their volley, they shoot at each other, they're maybe about like 40 feet from each other. They fire their guns like a collective shotgun, and then they start reloading, and then the British line starts firing theirs, and they just keep shooting at each other until one side gives up. It might sound kind of stupid, and you're not supposed to duck, you just stand there and take it like a man. Nevertheless, the Americans win in that kind of combat, right? That's the style of traditional fighting in European military battles. The Americans win. This helps convince the French that, hey, they can actually do it. Right? This is all about survival. It's all about credibility. It's all plays in the Washington strategy. And so by 1778, the French join the war, and that really turns the tables. Now, because why? The British now have to deal not just with some colonial uprisings in North America, but they have to deal with the French back home in Europe. They have to deal with the French in the Caribbean. They have to deal with the French in India, right? And the Americans, who don't have a navy, now have access to French ships. Now, American diplomats will complain, particularly a guy, John Adams, who will be important later as the second president of the United States, and he's actually one of the most important people in the Continental Congress. But he'll constantly complain the French never send enough ships. But nevertheless, the French Navy is what's key to the Americans winning their own independence, right? So the international dimensions of the American Revolution are super important, because if it was just the colonies against the empire, as much as, and I love a good underdog story, as much as you might love the kind of myth about that, right? They really had no other option but relying on the French, and the French are what really delivered the goods for the Americans. And this was really important because the British kept putting the squeeze on the Americans. Right? In 1776, they lose New York, one of their big commercial outputs. 1777, they lose Philadelphia, which is going to be important for when we talk about the Pennsylvania version. And in 1780, they try a new strategy where the British try to come up through the South and say, right, maybe they're more loyal if we can kind of chop off half of the United States and the southern colonies come back to us, then we can just sort of squeeze Massachusetts and Virginia to death. But it doesn't really work, because a lot of the backcountry people in South Carolina become radicalized as patriots, and this doesn't really pay off for the British. I mean, there are some merchants in South Carolina who are pretty much traitors. They ride the fence. If the Americans are winning, they're for the American Revolution and independence. If the British start winning, then to hell with it. They'd rather stick with the British, and it's all about selling rice, selling indigo, right? All those Carolina slave merchants. So the British are squeezing the American in their cities, but America is not primarily an urban population. I mean, no country really is predominantly urban. So all these little small farmers continue fighting, even if they lose these cities. Ultimately, the battles will keep raging, as you'll see in the textbook. There's a number of them, right? They take the north. They try to take the north. That doesn't work. They try through the south. That doesn't work. Eventually, George Washington, in conjunction with the French Navy, will corner the main British commander at the time, who's far more famous as a successful commander in India. But this is after that. But he's still cutting his teeth. General Cornwallis, he gets trapped at a naval town in Virginia known as Yorktown. The French Navy defeats the British, and a combination of American and French forces surround Cornwallis, and he has to surrender. 1781 is the great definitive blow against the British. But the war is still not over, and the British are still very powerful, even if they don't have a army in the field able to take out the Americans. But by 1781, it's pretty clear that the British, um, are on the defensive at this point. You can see in the textbook there's some information about how the diplomatic process kind of unfolds, but just to make a long story short, or even a short story even shorter, the Americans kind of get their way. They get a great treaty recognizing their independence, reestablishing their trade relations with the British, and kind of cash out as a new independent world power at the Treaty of Paris. So they come out, right? The Americans have still strong relations with Britain, even though, right, they had been just fighting against them. And they have some decent trade relationships with the French, though not as strong as the French would like, which is actually what helps provoke the financial crisis that we're going to see in another lecture when we talk briefly about the French Revolution. But the Americans get a good deal. 1783, they're the new independent power in the world, and the revolution is a success. So now I want to focus on Pennsylvania's own particular experience of the Revolution, which is in fact one of the most radical colonies that go through the Revolution. And it kind of highlights some of the dynamics, as I mentioned earlier, of how the American Revolution is actually a revolutionary event. Right? There's a little section, it might be kind of hard to understand in the textbook about how different historians disagree about whether the revolution was really revolutionary or if it was just an independence movement, but society didn't change at all. Either way, right, you don't have to get into all that, but I think Pennsylvania shows you, at least in some instances, it highlights some of the problems of what a revolution actually looks like. It raises the stakes, it raises certain issues that show that society is actually going through a pretty substantial change, right? Maybe it's not the same in every colony. Every colony has its own components. Some colonies remain relatively conservative. They don't change very much going through independence, which ironically one of those places is Massachusetts. Massachusetts has one of the more conservative revolutions, even though it's the ringleader for the whole group of colonies in some ways. But Pennsylvania is on the other side of the spectrum. And so we're going to look at how these questions sort of influence the development of American society post-independence and into building a new nation. So first, a key part, which is unlike any of the other colonies, both factions of the elites in Pennsylvania society join with the British. Now, in most colonies, you saw a split, right? So in Massachusetts, for example, some of the merchant elite joined with the British. Others of the merchant elite joined the Patriot cause for independence, and it kind of fractures down this line. New York, there's similar experience in parts of throughout the colonies that there are these different kind of experiences. But nevertheless, in Pennsylvania, both groups, right? We talked about how Pennsylvania is the first to have actual political parties. So you have the Proprietary Party that's much more in favor of integration with the British. Then you have the Quaker Party, which is much more merchant focused and defending Pennsylvania's unique status and its own rights, particularly the rights of the assembly. But both Quakers and proprietors think that independence is a terrible idea for their own reasons, and they both turn against it, which opens up space for people lower down the totem pole who are engaged in Pennsylvania politics but aren't actually the movers and shakers. It kind of creates an opening for them to kind of assert themselves. So I want to kind of put these two together, right? So Pennsylvania has had a long tradition of popular politics. That's what we saw in the last or 2 lectures ago when we're talking about the development of Pennsylvania as a colony, right? Whether it was the Quakers doing their own like NGO peace activism, sort of working for the government but not technically part of the government, trying to create their own peace treaties with the Iroquois and Indian nations, which to make a long story short, because I'm not going to get into it too much, but the Iroquois during the American Revolution end up splitting. Some of the nations end up joining with the British. Some of the other nations end up joining with the Americans, and this ends up destroying the very foundation of the Iroquois Empire, right? That they all are supposed to act like as a single fist. But if two fingers go one way and three fingers go the other way, that's not an effective fist. The Iroquois ability to have a united foreign policy ends up falling apart, and ultimately they're diminished as a power as the Americans sort of force them. And you see that in the Treaty of Grenville in the textbook. You can look that up if you want to know more. But that ends the Iroquois as sort of a dominant political power. Nevertheless, right, Iroquois were part of Quakers developing their own sort of political action, even outside the official channels of government. You had militias, right, that Benjamin Franklin kind of developed by politicizing the German people living in Philadelphia, in Germantown. And then, of course, you had the Paxton Boys. And there's a variety of other people groups, right, where they're fighting against or for the government, but on their own terms. There was a long tradition of political activism and political organization within Pennsylvania. So anyway, Quakers, proprietors, they are not in favor at all of any movement towards independence. But there are people in Pennsylvania, namely in Philadelphia, the small shop owners. If you're going to talk about classes, you would call them petty bourgeois. Means like small owners. They have little tracts of land. They own shops. They're not poor by any stretch of the imagination, but they're not rich, and they don't have elite access to government. So they're not the Quaker merchants who are super wealthy and they live in all the prestigious parts of Philadelphia. They're basically middle class, right? Now, they are very much in favor of independence. So in 1775, a group of them, right, drawing on this tradition of political activism, they form what's known as the Associators. So they see what's happening in Massachusetts. They see the crown kind of impinging upon colonial rights. So the Associators is a military association. It's basically a private militia that the citizens of Philadelphia kind of collectively pool together, and they do this, right, despite the Pennsylvania government actually choosing not to do this. So here's a potential for conflict, right? What happens when a private, citizen-motivated group claims to represent the people and forms their own military unit, right? Expressly against, right, the Pennsylvania Assembly, which is the democratically elected, mostly, representative government for Pennsylvania, right? They didn't want to create an army, but now private citizens, by sort of doing their own organization, have created a military of sorts. The Assembly is trying to figure out how to balance this. So the Assembly creates what's called the Committee of Safety, and they say, look, you associators, right, we believe what you're doing. You're trying to help protect Philadelphia, but, we're going to put you under government oversight, right? So you're not in control of yourselves. Now you respond to us. But this seemed to be kind of a traitorous blow. The Pennsylvania Assembly, right, they are not really in favor of pursuing independence. They're not in favor of granting electoral citizenship rights to every Pennsylvanian, which means that there are still some people, plenty of people, who don't own enough property so they can't vote. And most treacherous of all, the Assembly, now trying to control the Associators, says not everyone has to serve. And this was a key part of the Associators, was that they required universal military subscription. Means everyone in Philadelphia who's an able-bodied man has to serve. And why is this important? Because, hey, collectively, and this is sort of an issue that we're going to see, pop up, is that, wait, who represents the people, right? If we're the people, does everyone have to participate? Do only some people have to participate? What about these merchants, right? How do we trust them? They're the merchants dominating the Assembly with their issues and their interests, right? How can we trust them, right? They're not willing to fight. They're not willing to sacrifice their wealth, their privilege. They're willing to sort of, gamble a little bit. Well, if the independence thing, we want to seem like we're on that side, But, you know, if it's not going so well, we don't want to antagonize the British, because what if they come for us, right? And we're going to see that that's precisely what they do. But this is still very early on, the 75, 76. So the Associators are deeply offended by this. They feel like the assembly is betraying them. And remember, and this is a key part, and this brings up interesting questions about religion, is that the assembly merchants, who are dominant as a faction, as the Quaker Party, Quakers are pacifists. They're not, according to their own convictions, permitted to wage war, physical war, right? So, okay, well, maybe that's a real conviction. Or, right, and this is what the Associators, and particularly Thomas Paine, starts to insinuate. This is a very convenient excuse if you didn't really want to risk your wealth. It's a very easy to say, oh, I can't fight in the war, you know, it's my religion, I'm sorry, I wish I could. Um, so the assembly actually, which not all Quakers are in the assembly actually tries to come through a compromise, right? And they say, well, if you don't want to fight, if you can't, because you're a Quaker, and there's another group of pacifist Christians known as the Moravians, who are mainly Germans, who are also sort of under suspicion. If you don't want to fight, that's fine. But you got to donate money. You got to put your money where your mouth is. You got to donate money so that you can pay someone to fight for you, or that your money can be used to buy equipment, whether it's guns, outfit, you know, uniforms, food supplies, whatever, right? So you got to be able to participate that way. And this was Thomas Paine's idea, you know, who helped encourage this, right? Okay, he's trying to moderate the more radicals to say, no, you're lying, you got to get out there and fight. And, you know, people were just saying, you know, totally against this. So Thomas Paine tries to moderate this, and a number of independents, patriots, are trying to moderate this too. But the Quakers refuse, right? Because they would say, and this is their reasoning, well, what's the difference, right? If I go out there and shoot someone with a gun, I'm fighting a war, I'm violating my conscience, I'm sinning. But what's the difference between that and me paying someone to do that? If I pay you to go shoot someone, right, that's still murder legally. You know, hiring a hitman or something. So if I just allow someone else, I donate money to the war cause, I'm still participating in the war, and I'm still sinning, and I can't do that. It's against my conscience. Sorry. Again, you could say, okay, this is a reasonable request. This is their religion. This is their beliefs about the world. This is their ethics. That's what they say. So you should just leave them alone. But again, for someone like Thomas Paine and for some of these patriots, many of these patriots, this is really convenient. Again, these are people who benefit from the British Empire. They're the ones who are merchants predominantly. And the Quakers have become a very close, tight-knit clique of families. They're all marrying into each other. They all kind of shared their merchant interests. And so not literally all of them are merchants, but everyone was related to a merchant, and everyone's wealth and fortune was connected to the merchants. So this is really convenient. Oh, I can't fight a war, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, and then you can benefit from it. You can keep trading. You can still make a lot of money. So for some, like Thomas Paine, he starts writing these tracts against the Quakers saying, you're lying. Your religion is fake. You're just using it to sort of excuse yourself to commit greed, to commit treason to your countrymen, and you need to be dealt with. So the Associators start putting pressure. They start becoming more radicalized. 1776 sees a new, fresh election for the Assembly, but the pro-independence Patriot cause does very poorly. Only one out of the 4 representatives for Philadelphia that get to go to the Assembly are part of the, or only 1 out of the 4 support independence. So actually Thomas Paine leads the charge and says, well, we can't even take the Assembly seriously. It doesn't represent all of Philadelphia. It doesn't represent all of Pennsylvania because you're still requiring property restrictions. And in fact, there's actually a kind of a debate where on the one hand, some pro-independence people say, well, we can't question the Assembly. It's our government. It's an elected government. But some more radical patriots say, no, we have to question it. The Assembly is a creation of the British Crown. We just got it doesn't even represent the people. Just throw it out. So again, you could say that's a real argument from conviction, right? This is a product of the British Empire. It has property restrictions that are not allowing every Pennsylvanian to vote. It's got its own kind of management structure that it's kind of diminishing what the people actually want. So we should just reject and throw out this institution because it does not speak for the voice of the people. But of course, who are the people, right? It's very convenient. You lose an election and then you say, oh no, the assembly doesn't even count anyway. None of the votes matter. And it's very convenient to say, it doesn't represent the voice of the people when you're not even totally clear who are these people anyway. And so some people who are defenders of the assembly, they come out and say, Thomas Paine and some of these other guys, right? Thomas Paine's not even from Pennsylvania. He's actually from England. He's a immigrant in his own life. He comes to Pennsylvania and he's just stirring up trouble. They're just importing people to basically advance their cause. And so this raises up a very serious political issue about immigration and citizen rights. Can anyone just vote? Right? What if, and there's a concern about, this is where property requirements came from. What if you're really poor and someone just comes along and says, hey, I'll give you free money if you vote for me? What stake does he have in the community? He gets his check, he gets to go home, and then the people who have built their homes, their lives, everything, they lose it all to basically a would-be tyrant. So the whole point of this was to sort of restrain the worst behavior, but of course the other side is it's not as democratic as it should be. So this raises questions about who's allowed to vote, who actually represents people, and I'm not going to get into all this, but this is still an issue with us today. So, all right, to make this a long story really short, but right over the course of the revolution, Pennsylvania becomes even more radical and intense. Right, you start seeing the experience of direct democracy. So eventually, right, the assembly is rejected as an institution. Sort of the citizens of Philadelphia make their own kind of committee. They form a military association. So basically start enacting forms of censorship. So no one's allowed to criticize the war effort because this would diminish the ability for the war to actually be conducted. There is, and this is all happening, right, as I said earlier in the lecture, right, I showed you at least, Philadelphia gets occupied in 1777, and then the British leave, which only kind of intensified animosity, because guess what, when the British came, all of the elites sort of poured out into the city and said, okay, right, you're here, our heroes, you saved us, and then they leave. And then this leaves the population of Philadelphia, which is enraged, frustrated, and oppressed, to sort of get their sort of revenge, basically, against the traitors, basically people who, to them, sold Pennsylvania out for a bag of silver, 30 pieces of silver. So anyway, 70, 80 to 83 becomes even more radical. They create this committee. They abolish the assembly. The committee is voted on sort of block by block in terms of neighborhoods. So it has much more democratic representation. They have forms of direct democracy, which means the people of Philadelphia just show up and they get to vote. They don't appoint representatives. They kind of shout out what they, whatever they want to vote on. So you see some of that. And elite people who had defended the British, supported the loyalist Tory cause, right, stay within the British Empire, they get ejected from positions of power and they're silenced. Additionally, you see some cases of merchants' storehouses being sacked. And by that I mean a merchant, he's bringing in food, trading with other parts of the world. He brings in this food. He's got a big warehouse. But, in a time of war or famine or a time of necessity, right, what could a merchant do? He could price gouge. So he could say, look, you guys all really want bread, right? You're really hungry. So instead of it being $5 for a loaf of bread, it's now $10. Why? Because you want it, right? You'll pay for it, right? Is this fair? Is this just? Can people just sell things for whatever price they want? What if it's food? What if people will literally die, starve to death, because this guy's trying to make a killing, literally, off of his product. So there were some cases where these Quaker merchants who are considered to be storing their goods, right? They're trying to basically starve Philadelphia so that they'll submit to the British. There are cases where I think in Philadelphia it's a group of women, but in some cases it's a group of women. Sometimes it's just an angry mob of dudes or dudes and women. They burst into the storehouse and just take the food out, and they don't steal it necessarily. They pay the guy, but they pay a guy not what he wants, but what they tell them is the fair price. Um, so all of this really raises this big question, and this is a really big political question, which I'm not going to try to solve, but we're going to look at this more over the course of the class, and it's an issue that I don't plan to solve. It's an issue that needs to be sort of worked out. You're going to have to think about it for yourself in your own time. But right, when you have a political body, a country, say, um, you gotta balance the rights of the country as a whole with the rights of the individual, right? Um, I mean, you don't have to balance it. Sometimes you just try to delete them. But most cases, right, you have to recognize, right, there are individuals in the world, so you as a person, and then there's the group. And so on the one hand, you probably would say it's bad to sacrifice the group for the one person. So, if that one person didn't want to go along with what the group wanted, and that activity would save the group or benefit the group, and they would just say, oh, okay, right, he doesn't want to do it, so I guess we can't do it. You probably would say, like, maybe the group should be able to survive and save itself, even if it's at the expense of one person's conscience or his well-being or whatever. On the other hand, you wouldn't necessarily want the individual sacrificed totally for the group, right? So there's a kind of cliched statement. A lot of, and democracy is a kind of dirty word during this time. Democracy starts to take on positive notions later on, but most of the patriots do not like democracy. And democracy basically means mob rule. It means a bunch of random people in the street doing whatever they want, not thinking about the group, not thinking about, or not the group per se, but they're not thinking about the individuals who own and have a stake in the country. They're not thinking about the future. It's just sort of a mindless rabble. So a cliche from this era is like, what is democracy? Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. Right? Obviously, if it's two wolves and a sheep, and they say, what are we going to eat? The two wolves are going to vote for the sheep. The sheep's going to vote for not the sheep, and maybe grass. Boom, right? The sheep's done. He gets eaten. So the fear is in a pure democracy, without laws, without rights, or that are not subject to popular opinion, that minorities would be sacrificed. And of course, today we might think of minorities as racial minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, whether sexual identity or gender identity or whatever. But the minorities that they're thinking about primarily in this period are wealthy minorities, right? The wealthy few, right? Should their wealth be subject to everyone, right? Should the community be able to reappropriate it whenever they want? Now, some Republican theorists said, of course, right? The needs of the community exceed the individual's right to be wealthy. He gained that wealth by being a member of that community, and so as a good Republican, we can seize the wealth as the state, which represents the collective body of citizens, and kind of use it for purposes. And now you had to justify it. You couldn't just take people's money because you wanted to, but the community outweighed the individual. And then there are other people, I'm kind of simplifying it, but this is typically associated with what's known as liberalism, which is connected with John Locke, which has said, no, the individual, particularly the wealthy individual, to own property, that's the whole reason government exists. So if government starts taking people's property, then it's stepping way out of bounds, right? Isn't that what we're rebelling against with the British? They're threatening the rights of people to own property. And so never, ever can the government, except in an incredible crisis, ever requisition people's property against their own will. Now, of course, no one believes in absolute property rights where, you have total control over something and the government can never ask it of you, right? In the American Constitution, it's the idea of eminent domain. But that's not really what's at issue. The issue is, how do you conceptualize what society is about? Is a society about protecting individuals? Is a society about protecting the society? How do individuals relate to societies? Are individuals sort of like bouncing around within it? Do individuals become themselves within the society, that they're defined by the society, that you can't even really be an individual without being a part of a group? And so, in defense of this idea, you just think about yourself, right? Who are you? It's a very abstract question, but an easy way to answer that is just how you relate to all the social bodies that are around you. If I say, who are you? You tell me who you're related to. I'm the son or daughter of this person. I'm the brother or sister of this person. I'm this person's cousin. It might be your relationship to your work. It tells who are you? I'm an employee at this place. I do this or that or the other thing. Or you're a student at Northampton, right? This is who you are as an individual. All these different social relationships. So anyway, the point being in all of this is that Philadelphians are really struggling with the idea of trying to balance property, trying to balance individual rights, but also not destroying the entire colony, the newly independent state, and especially Philadelphia, because wealthy merchants just say, hey, you know what, this is my stuff and you can't have it. Even though the whole life of the community, whether it's money to buy weapons to protect the city, or it's food to feed the soldiers and the people who live in the city who are potentially being price gouged because everyone's suffering because it's a war. It was trying to balance this stuff and the needs of the people, which the people in this case, the sort of radical elements, represented these small shop owners, these small manufacturers, um, you know, workers in skilled professions, and small property owners. So a guy who owns a little farm, not a massive plantation, but a little farm that he can kind of tend himself. Those people, collectively need to be protected against the wealth and power of the few. So Philadelphia really struggles with these questions. Ultimately, they could appear in kind of brutal fashion. So the Quakers are not to be trusted at a certain point. So the Philadelphia Public Safety or Committee of Public Safety decides to pack up 40 Quaker elites who had decided for the British. They arrest them, they cart them off to jail in Virginia to be held because they're not to be trusted. They might use their wealth to defend the British, and they're going to maybe open the gates to the enemy when the city's not aware. Of course, during this process, they round them up and they ship them out to Virginia. During this process, 2 of them die, right? Because they're kind of getting manhandled and disease is rampant. It's war. They're maybe not getting as much food as they should or whatever. And they ship out the Quakers, and then after that, every citizen of Philadelphia is given the committee passes a law called the Test Act, which is common in political history, which requires some examination of every subject or citizen whether they're loyal. So in Britain, there had been different times during the time of Queen Elizabeth I and King William III where the monarch sent around loyalty oaths. So are you going to pledge your loyalty to me? So the committee doing this was sort of a form of this where they asked everyone, are you loyal to the new Constitution of Pennsylvania? Are you loyal to its new government? Not to the old assembly, not to the old Constitution, but to us. And if you said you weren't loyal, you lost all your rights and privileges. So, this might seem really repressive and restrictive, but the idea is that citizenship comes with responsibilities, and if you're going to throw those away, then there's nothing left, right? If in this time of war, you really got to decide which side you're on. You can't just say, oh, both sides have merits, right? No, life and death is at stake. You got to pick a side. So this is part of this. Nevertheless, as you see, Pennsylvania kind of rolls back these reforms. When the revolution ends, more moderate, calm heads prevail. The Constitution, the more radical democratic one, gets repealed. A new constitution is passed, but it embodies some of these elements. So on the one hand, direct democracy is done away with, but property requirements are lowered. But right, there still exists because they're afraid that people who are these kind of radical agitators, they want to kind of lock them out of power. So Pennsylvania introduces poll taxes, which means you just poll refers as a kind of archaic way of referring to your head. So a poll tax is, do you exist? Do you have a head? Great, you got to pay a tax. Now, the United States eventually makes this illegal, but the reason why you institute a poll tax is that if you can't afford to pay the tax, then you lose your citizenship rights, therefore you can't vote. So this was a way of locking out some people from participating in electoral politics. The Pennsylvania Constitution is trying to restabilize, and of course, to restabilize, they need wealth and access to trade. Philadelphia, of course, is a trading center. So they invite all of these Quakers, all of these loyalists who had pledged themselves to the British government and said, look, the past is the past. All is forgiven. Please come back home. Please continue to trade. Please continue to bring wealth into our state, and we'll forget about all of it. So, sometimes the ways war ends, and this is why maybe there's a dimension to Pennsylvania that makes it like a civil war, or maybe even more broadly, the American Revolution is like a civil war, but you'll have to make that assessment for yourself. That might be on the test. Hint, hint. Anyway, if you're going to kind of move beyond civil war, you got to just forgive and forget. You can't remember and punish all these people, especially if they're wealthy people and they're going to bring business back to your country. So you see that in a lot of countries where there's some intense civil strife. They just have to sort of get over it and kind of, in some ways, sometimes they just forget. Now, of course, this is sometimes a great crime because, hey, there were some issues that weren't settled, right? And so in Pennsylvania, right, the idea that they got to put their individual privileges over the rights of the community. Nevertheless, most people kind of got over it. It wasn't that bad. It's not like what you see in some countries where there's intense violence and murdering and killing and retribution between two groups. And right, direct democracy is done away with, and they kind of reinstall something that looks like like the old Pennsylvania Assembly. Except in this case, rather than the old one, which only had one house, the new Pennsylvania Assembly has two houses. It has an upper house and a lower house, a Senate and a House of Representatives, which is more in line with how all the other states operate. So this kind of reapportions power. The Senate, the upper body of the Pennsylvania Assembly, it's elected, but it tends to represent wealthier people in the state, whereas the House of Representatives, more and more people can have access and kind of run for that and vote in that. So anyway, Pennsylvania's assembly kind of normalizes and becomes a lot like the other states, and they kind of try to clamp down on some of the more radical activity. But as we'll see in future lectures, and we're going to get into the next lecture with, your textbook already kind of mentioned Shays' Rebellion. We're going to get into that, why that happens and why it's important. But even to the rise of Thomas Jefferson as a key political figure and a political thinker for the American Revolution, we're going to see the sort of radical elements of American democracy reemerge, right? Who is the people, right? Is it the wealthy and educated who can speak on behalf of the people because they're too stupid to do it for themselves? Or do more average people get a shake at it, right? Do they get a chance to participate in elections? Do they get a chance to participate even in running for government, in being elected to government, and actually being a part of the groups running things? And more importantly, right, what does democracy ultimately mean? Is it just a form of politics? Is it a form of social organization? How far does it go? Do you apply it to religion? Do you apply it to economics? Do you apply it some places but not apply it to others? Is democracy a good thing or a bad thing? Right, we're going to cover some of this in other lectures, but until then, this is John Parks. I'll send you out an email with the first exam, and we'll get into that soon. But until next week, right, I'm your host. Keep hanging in there. I'll see you then. Peace.